pollution control substance monitoring will present reports on the cost of establishing stations for monitoring of controlled substances and sustainable funding options for such monitoring stations. In April, the ozone research managers at their 12th meeting also addressed and endorsed the monitoring of controlled substances as a natural activity under the Vienna Convention and its trust funds. ORM also agreed with the outcomes of the online workshop convened by the Ozone Secretariat and the Steering Committee to discuss cost estimates with experts in the field. We are excited to present to you these outcomes and reports to inform your discussions under Agenda Item 5. Other agenda items have been passed on from 35th MOP, such as the very short-lived substances, feedstock uses of controlled substances, and carbon tetrachloride emissions under Agenda Item 3. Other agenda items have been passed, energy efficiency funding support for countries affected by COVID-19, and the options for changes to Form 3 to support HFC 23 reporting are other priority issues as well. Delegates, you clearly have a lot of work ahead of you this week. Now, before I hand over the floor back to the co-chairs, please allow me to introduce Pablo Moscoso de la Cuba, a new staff member who officially joined the Ozone Secretariat at this meeting, flying in straight from Peru. He's on my left over there. So he is just 4 years old in the Secretariat, and he is replacing Gilbert Bancobeza as our new Senior Legal Officer. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you very fruitful discussions and a productive week. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Executive Secretary for her statement, and we thank the much work done by the Ozone Secretariat in collaborating and coordinating with other relevant conventions. And we also hope that one day we will also get ice creams. Delegates, you will see that we have a full agenda and much work ahead of us. Let us work together to get through our business efficiently. I would now like to hand over the floor to my co-chair, Ralph. Ralph.
The mic is working now. Thank you, Miruza. And before proceeding, I just would like to say a couple of words to welcome everybody here in Montreal, also on behalf of my co-chair. And for many of us, it feels like home ice, as we are here more often than during the MOPs, OEWGs, and also definitely during XCOMs. And the only thing that is missing is the ice outside. So, but the weather is good, so that's the plus. Miruza, the Secretariat, and I will do everything we can to have a fruitful meeting and work with you all to come as far as possible with draft decisions to be presented for the COP-MOP in later this year. So that's something you can reckon on. Let us now move to agenda item 2. Agenda item 2 with organizational matters. And first we talk about the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda is contained in document 46/1 Rev 1 and the annotated agenda in document 46/1 Add 1. I would like to see if delegates wish to make changes or add items to the provisional agenda. If delegates have any specific issues to be discussed under agenda item 6D or any other issues, or under agenda item 14, other matters. Item 6D is any other issues under the presentation of the TEEP progress report. And the purpose of that agenda item is to allow parties to raise any issues of importance that coming directly from the TEEP report. And that's worthwhile to mention and are not adequately covered in the agenda. Raising such issues at this time will enable both the parties and the TEEP to be better prepared for the discussions when we come to those agenda items. Agenda item 14 is on other matters, under which any other matters that are not raised from the TEEP reports may be put forward by a party, and request that delegates will raise them now. So I would like to hear from parties here in the room what kind of items they would like to add to 6D, any other issues related to the TEEP report, and agenda item 14, other matters. Please clearly indicate under which agenda item you would like to add them. Please, who would like to take the floor on this? I see Kyrgyzstan is requesting for the floor. Kyrgyzstan, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, we are speaking the first time, and we wish to take this opportunity to thank the Canadians for the excellent organization of this conference. Turning to the agenda item, other matters, Kyrgyzstan would like to add the question on preventing the undesirable import of non-energy effective substances in agenda item 14 under AOB. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyrgyzstan. Could you once repeat what is the issue exactly, so we can hear it once again on the agenda item 14?
We would like to have this meeting consider the question of the illegal, undesirable import of non-energy effective equipment, and to introduce this item for the consideration of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you. I now clearly understood it. United States, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. Let us just start by thanking the Secretariat for all their work in preparation for the meeting, and also to congratulate and thank our co-chairs for their taking on this leadership role to guide the discussions for us this year. It's very much appreciated. I'm sorry, it's just a minor matter of clarification. When I hear you reading off the numbers of the agenda items, they're not matching. So I kind of think I see what you have done, but could you please clarify specifically when you're talking about numbers of agenda items? They do not appear to me to match what I have in 46/1/Rev1. I'm figuring it out, of course, so not a big deal, but it would actually be helpful to know exactly what the numbering is we're working off of. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, we were already jumping a little bit ahead by the revised agenda. It means that 6D is any other issues related to the TEEP report. And Then other matters is 11. So that's already done because the business are already covered in it, so that's one of the reasons. So, are there any other requests for the floor? I don't see any other requests for the floor. So there is, let's say, the proposal of Kyrgyzstan, and that's dealing with illegal import of equipment under agenda item, let's say, 11. Which will become 14 later on, and so is that acceptable to include it on the agenda and then adopt the agenda? Then the agenda is adopted. Sorry. Once again, I will continue with agenda item 2B, organization of work. I would now like to turn to agenda item 2B, organization of work, and discuss the order and timing on the whole agenda. On the screen you can see the proposed order of our work that we just adopted. And we also make the changes in the agenda by, let's say, replacing the business with regular numbers. Right after the organization of work, we will start with agenda item 3, presentations of TEEP and SAP, followed by question and answer session, and the discussion of each of the sub-items. And we hope to get through that by lunch today. After lunch, we take up agenda item 4 on life cycle refrigerant management, and that will be followed by item 5 on atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances. And we will expect that will take us to the end of this day. Tomorrow morning, we continue with agenda item 6 on the presentation of the TEEP 2024 progress report. And we go through all the subjects that are listed over there. And we expect that it will be take us the whole morning, and then we would move to item 6 or item 7 on climate-friendly alternatives for meter-dose inhalers. And then we are around lunchtime. After lunch, we move to agenda item 8 on future availability of halons. And then consider agenda item 9 on possible compliance deferral for Article 5 Group 2 parties, giving also TEEP the opportunity to present its report on technology review. Then we will take up agenda item 10, strengthening Montreal Protocol institutions, including combating illegal trade. And then we will end for that day, and there will be a reception later on. Looking at the slide for Wednesday, we expect to begin the day with the consideration of agenda item 11, potential changes to the reporting form on HFC 23, and then we move to agenda item 12, the proposal by Cuba for additional funding to support countries affected by COVID-19. Followed then by the agenda item on other matters. You can see on the screen what is the following order. As we get through all the substantive agenda items, we will establish contact groups and informal groups as necessary, and if all goes planned, then some of the Wednesday afternoon and most of the Thursday and Friday can be allocated to a meeting of those groups, and we reconvene in plenary as needed. As always, there are a lot of agenda items on to deal with, and we have to be prudent with our time, so take that in mind as well, and consistent with our practice, we will ensure that none of the contact groups and informal groups meet simultaneously. On Friday, when all the work on all the substantive agenda items have been completed, we will adopt a report of the meeting and then move to the closure of the meeting at the end. Now, a few housekeeping matters. The morning sessions will run from 10 to 1 p.m. and the afternoon sessions from 3 till 6. As our usual practice, and we did it today, we will be starting all sessions on time, and we would like to ask the delegates to be in the conference room before 10 a.m. for the morning session and before 3 p.m. in the afternoon. During the lunch breaks and in the evenings there will be quite some side events, and we would like to encourage you to participate whenever possible. The timings of the plenary and the group meeting will be projected on the plenary screen after every session and announced on the screens around the venue and in the meeting portal. So keep an eye on them. Last year, the OSN Secretariat developed a simple and easily accessible app, and I hope you have it downloaded. You can access through the app all the meeting information, daily schedule documents, and the streaming of the plenary sessions. And the users of the app will receive a notification on any changes to the schedule and urgent matters. For booking meeting rooms, please direct any request to Abiodun Didoni, and he sits on the left. Yeah. So please contact him. The email is indicated on the screen and the meeting and in the meeting information page of the meeting portal. Regarding the conference room papers, please submit them in an electronic form as soon as possible to Mrs. Liazat Rabiosi, and she's sitting here on my left. And Liazat's email is also indicated on the screen and in the meeting portal. Please bear in mind, as usual, we have some constraints with translation. Any CRP submitted before the lunch break on Thursday would be translated and made available in the 6 official UN languages. After that time, documents will be only made available in English or in any other UN language of submission. If you need any help or information, please seek assistance from the OSN Secretariat Help Desk located outside the meeting hall on this floor. So, this is the end of organizational matters, and I would thank you for listening, and I would ask if there are any requests for the floor, and I see Bahrain is asking for the floor. Bahrain, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to congratulate the co-chair for chairing this meeting, and I'm confident that we are going to be in good hands. I would like to thank the Secretariat for the excellent preparation for this meeting, as well as preparing all the documents on the portal. I would also like to extend my thanks to the Government of Canada. I have no objection. I only have a point that I would like to tell you that from the left part of the hall we cannot see the screen, so we cannot see anything on the screens, and therefore if you can please put the presentations on both projectors on both sides of the hall. Thank you very much indeed.
thank you by raising it, and I think it will be fixed in a moment, that in both sides there could be the information on the screen, or is that not possible? One moment.
Thank you very much. The idea was to kind of try to swap, from time to time, so that not one side is looking at the camera all the time or the agenda all the time. But at your request, we are very happy to change that plan and make sure that we have the agenda item slides posted on both screens. Thank you.
Are there any other requests for the floor? And it will be fixed, let's say, I hope so, as soon as possible. But I think it's good to continue. I don't see any other requests for the floor, so I would like to hand over to my co-chair, Miruza.
Thank you, Rolf. We will now consider agenda item 3 on the presentation by the TEEP and the SEP on the following issues. 3A, very short-lived substances. B, feedstock uses of controlled substances. And emissions of carbon tetrachloride. The discussions of these issues will be held under the sub-items of agenda item 3 after the presentation. I would like to invite the members of the TEEP and the SEP to come up to the podium to present to us their key findings. And as they make their way to the podium, let me mention that the addendum to the note by the Secretariat, which is document 46/2, Ed 1, includes summaries of these issues, and the full reports are contained in the relevant parts of the TEEP 2024 progress report, which is available on the meeting portal. The exact references can also be seen on the screen. I thank the TEEP and the SEP for their hard work, and now I would like to give the floor to them for their presentation. And after the presentation, I will open the floor for a brief question and answer session before the substantive discussion under the sub-items. TEEP, you have the floor.
All right, can we get it here somehow? Okay, thank you. Apologies for the delay. Thank you very much. I'm here to talk about the contributions that the SAP provided to TEEP in our collaborative efforts to respond to these 3 decisions related to short-lived substances, feedstock uses, and carbon tetrachloride. I'm here to speak not for, but on behalf of the co-chairs of the SAP, and I also want to mention that there are a number of contributors to mention who also added to what we're showing here: Matt Rigby, Luke Western of the UK, and the NOAA and A-Gauge data providers. So before I begin, I'd just like to start with an overview related to Decision 6 on short-lived substances, to just contrast, use this figure, this schematic that was included in the SAP's 2022 report, contrasting the long-lived ozone-depleting substances on the left side of the figure with the very short-lived substances to highlight the differences and the difficulties and the challenges associated with understanding the influence of short-lived substances on the ozone layer compared to long-lived substances, where the short-lived substances, for long-lived substances, well-mixed, what we measure at the surface is a good indication of the amount of chlorine and bromine, ozone-depleting halogen, that reaches the stratosphere and that interacts with stratospheric ozone. Whereas for short-lived substances, on the right side, you can see that there's many more processes involved that influence the efficiency with which those emissions reach the stratosphere. So what gets measured at the surface isn't as relevant to or as directly relatable to what makes it to the stratosphere. That process is dependent on a number of different factors that have large uncertainties related to the chemistry, mixing, and transport processes. And the removal of a good fraction, a large fraction of those emissions in the troposphere before that halogen reaches the stratosphere. So given that backdrop with respect to the difficulties associated with short-lived substances and estimating their impacts in the ozone layer, we go to the SAP input to decisions input to the decision number 6 related to short-lived substances, to point out the fact that the existing information on ODPs specifically for short-lived substances is collated in the annex to the 2022 SAP report and essentially remains unchanged. And although we do realize there's new information becoming available, that new information will be updated, in particular in the annex to the 2026 assessment report. Second, in relation to both decisions 35.6 and 35.8 related to short-lived substances and feedstock emissions, SAP was able to update the emission history for dichloromethane, or DCM, thanks to the input from the NOAA and A-gauge measurement communities and the modeling efforts of those Luke Western and Matt Rigby that I mentioned. This figure of emissions is included in the ozone assessment report from 2022, but what is new here are the 2 additional emission years, the 2 years worth of emissions in 2021 and 2022. And you can see that the emissions in those most recent years, updated here, with the numbers specifically included in Table 5.3 of the TEEPS report, are slightly, they extend the record of what's been measured and interpreted in the past. Similarly, for carbon tetrachloride, NOAA and A-gauge measurement records were updated and emissions derived over time to add 2 new points to this figure that shows the emissions of carbon tetrachloride over time as derived from those records. And this information is included in Table 521 of the TEEP updated report. And so that concludes the substantive updates from the SAP community that then you'll learn a lot more about in the TEEP presentation, and you will see in the TEEP report that are more directly relevant to, or additionally relevant to, those direct decisions and the requests for information in them. Thank you.
Oh, no. Yes, good morning. I'm Helen Tope, co-chair of the Medical and Chemical Technical Options Committee, and on behalf of the TEEP and its MCTOC, it's my honour to present TEEP's response to decisions 35.6, 35.8 and 35.9.
The next 3 slides reproduce the 3 relevant decisions covered in this presentation. Decision 35.6 on updated information on very short-lived substances. Decision 35.8 on feedstock uses. And Decision 35.9 on abating emissions of CTC. In preparing our responses to these decisions, TEEP and its 17 MCTOC chemical experts developed the responses to these decisions in consultation and cooperation with the Science Assessment Panel as appropriate. SAP provided updated science information as they have just presented, which was then incorporated into the report. The 2022 SAP assessment report was used as the main reference, with recent science papers included, as agreed in consultation with the Science Assessment Panel. The TEEP, the MCTOC and the SAP reviewed draft and final reports. For Decision 35.6 on updated information on very short-lived substances, many chlorinated hydrocarbons with very low but non-zero ODPs are not controlled under the Montreal Protocol and are monitored by atmospheric scientists. Collectively, they are known as very short-lived substances, or chlorinated very short-lived substances if they're chlorinated, because of their atmospheric lifetimes of less than 6 months. The report focuses on 5 chlorinated very short-lived substances that are very high volume chemical products: dichloromethane, trichloromethane or chloroform, ethylene dichloride, trichloroethylene, and perchloroethylene. Parties are not required to submit data on production of very short-lived substances to the Ozone Secretariat, so information in the report was obtained from industry experts, publicly available government and industry data, and from SAP as described. This slide summarises for 2022 estimated production of those chlorinated very short-lived substances and SAP estimated top-down emissions for dichloromethane. For dichloromethane, it is worth noting that 25% of dichloromethane production is for feedstock uses for HFC 32. Production of dichloromethane for emissive uses is therefore around 1,300 to 1,450 kilotons, which is consistent with the SAP estimated top-down global dichloromethane emissions for 2022. Each of these 5 chemicals that we've focused on is used as feedstock. Some also have emissive uses as solvent or foam-blowing agent. Feedstock usage of ethylene dichloride is close to 100%, and of chloroform is more than 90%. Ethylene dichloride's main feedstock application is the production of vinyl chloride monomer to polyvinyl chloride, which is the 3rd largest of the global plastics production. Chloroform is also used as a process agent solvent in the pharmaceutical industry, and dichloromethane is predominantly used in emissive uses such as solvent and foam blowing. Emissive dichloromethane use has been banned in some regions due to health risks. Trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene are also partly used as solvents. Regarding alternatives to the use of these chlorinated very short-lived substances, these alternatives were reviewed and have been previously reported by the MCTOC, the Foams Technical Options Committee, the former Solvents Technical Options Committee, the multilateral fund agencies, for similar emissive halocarbon uses in these sectors. Alternatives have generally not changed and remain relevant for very short-lived substances. Selection of alternatives is on a case-by-case basis for specific applications. For solvents, in order of preference, alternatives are aqueous and hydrocarbon surfactant or semi-aqueous cleaning, hydrocarbon solvent cleaning where the toxicity is lower than halogenated solvents, such as using acetone, halogenated solvents such as HFEs, HFOs, HCFOs, and hydrocarbon solvent cleaning where the toxicity is higher than halogenated solvents, so say toluene or dimethylformamide. For foam blowing, dichloromethane use is increasingly banned due to human health risks, and alternatives are well documented. Please refer to the 2022 TOC assessments reports for the latest solvent and foam blowing alternatives. Examples of alternative feedstock routes are provided in the report. Chlorinated hydrocarbons are generally chosen because the chlorine atom is readily replaced and the chemical structure is amenable to the desired end product. Now turning to Decision 35.8 on feedstock uses. In 2022, 15 parties reported feedstock uses of ozone-depleting substances, and 10 of these parties also produced ODS for feedstock uses. In 2022, total reported ODS production and import for feedstock uses was about 2 million tonnes, which is a 66% increase over the decade. The increase over the decade has been mostly due to the increase in feedstock uses of HCFCs, particularly HCFC 22. HCFC 22 is mainly used to produce tetrafluoroethylene, which is polymerized to make fluoropolymers that have many applications. Increasing demand for HCFO and HCFOs and HFOs and perchloroethylene is driving the more recent increase in carbon tetrachloride feedstock use. There's also been an increase in reported feedstock use of HCFC 244 and HCFC 21, used as feedstocks for different routes to produce HFO 1234YF. HFC 152A is the largest HFC feedstock use, for example, to produce vinyl fluoride that is then used to produce polyvinyl fluoride. This chart shows the trends in production and import for the main ODS feedstocks, with the percentage changes over 1 and 5 years and compound annual growth rate over 10 years tabulated in the progress report where you can see those. Emissions of controlled substances during production, distribution, feedstock use contribute to overall global emissions. Some feedstocks and byproducts have non-feedstock uses or have emissions from banks of rack HP equipment or from foams, which can prevent direct comparison of estimates of annual global emissions from feedstock production and use with estimates from atmospheric observations. Comparison was made of estimates of annual global emissions of controlled substances based on bottom-up calculations, where these could reasonably be made with currently available data, and annual global emissions estimated by the Science Assessment Panel based on atmospheric observations taken from the 2022 SAP Assessment Report and other agreed sources. Bottom-up calculations were made using emissions factors for production, feedstock production, supply chain and feedstock use, developed by the MCTOC in its 2022 assessment report. Most likely emission factors were applied to the amount of production for each substance. With the available data, substances selected for comparison are those listed here on the slide. The results of the comparisons of estimated annual global emissions are summarised on this slide. For several substances, such as 1,1,1-trichloroethane and CFC-113, there's reasonable agreement between bottom-up calculations and top-down estimates, although, according to SAP, top-down emission estimates for CFC-113 may have some small contribution from CFC-113A that is not yet well characterised. For some substances, such as CFC-114, HCFC-124, and HCFC-133A, there are differences between bottom-up calculations and top-down emission estimates. In some cases, possible reasons for these differences have been proposed. Emissions of HCFC-124 intermediate from HFC-125 production appear to make a significant contribution to total HCFC-124 emissions. Over 90% of reported HCFC-133A emissions are suggested to be due to emissions of intermediate HCFC-133A from the production of HFC-134A. However, for at least one substance, and the example being here, Halon 1301, a representative bottom-up calculation was not considered possible with the data currently available to TEEP. For example, for the feedstock use of Halon 1301 in fipronil production, the most likely emission factors that MCTOC have developed are not considered applicable, and adequate operational information is not available to better characterise the emission factor for this process. The Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee will discuss Halon 1301 emissions more in the progress report presentation. Regarding alternatives to feedstock uses of controlled substances, MCTOC has reviewed and updated the list of available alternatives to ODS feedstock together with including alternatives to HFC feedstock use. The list of alternatives to ODS feedstock uses has not changed significantly. Additional information on technical feasibility, economic viability, safety and sustainability is provided for large-scale feedstock uses. The outcome of the review indicates only a few technically and commercially possible alternatives to the controlled substance feedstocks currently used have been identified, and these alternatives do not cover all of those controlled substances. Those that are available are likely to require significant economic and/or technical hurdles to be overcome to be able to compete with or replace existing processes, equipment and supply chains that use controlled substance feedstocks. The absence of switching production to alternative, non-controlled substance feedstocks suggests that in many cases these hurdles do not make them attractive. Now we turn to Decision 35-9 on abating emissions of carbon tetrachloride. MCTOC has updated its global emissions estimations for carbon tetrachloride from industrial activity. MCTOC estimates global CTC emissions for 2022 from CTC production, handling, supply chain and use from non-chloromethanes production, legacy emissions from landfill, industrial and contaminated sites, and from some new unknown industry sources that have been reported but that are not yet fully characterised, and that those estimates total around 30 kilotons and between the range of 17 to 48 kilotons based on uncertainties. SAP estimates top-down global CTC emissions for 2022 from A-gauge data to be 43.6 kilotons with uncertainty plus or minus 14.1 kilotons, and from NOAA data to be 33.8 kilotons with uncertainty plus or minus 14.2 kilotons. Within the range of these uncertainties, the bottom-up and top-down global emissions estimates for CTC are now in general agreement. MCTOC, and SAP for that matter, will continue to review possible sources to refine its bottom-up estimates for its 2026 assessment report. The methodology for estimating bottom-up emissions of CTC is based on the SPARC report from 2016 and as outlined also in the Sherry et al. Paper from 2018, which you'll see listed in the notes to the slides that have been posted on the portal. And these using available updated information on CTC pathways, reported production and use, and estimated emission factors. Examples of potential and existing alternatives to current CTC feedstock uses to make products are available in the report in response to Decision 35.7, which we've just covered. CTC usage is quite specific in its main feedstock applications. Available alternatives are not as technically and/or economically feasible. Regarding best practices are available for minimising emissions from feedstock production, by-production and use, including for carbon tetrachloride, and are summarised here on this slide. Best practices have been reported and are detailed further in the 2022 MCTOC assessment report, the 2023 and 2024 TEEP progress reports, and this information remains unchanged. As some concluding remarks, TEEP has reviewed all the available information on chlorinated very short-lived substances, feedstock uses, and carbon tetrachloride. For carbon tetrachloride and dichloromethane, bottom-up and top-down emissions estimates are generally in good agreement within the uncertainties. And for feedstock uses, where there are differences, these are explored and/or explained. Any further information provided by parties or other information that becomes available will be reviewed and included for the 2026 assessment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, TEEP and SAP. And on behalf of all the parties, I would like to thank the TEEP and the SAP once again for their hard work, for their work and excellent reports containing extremely useful and valuable information. Now I would like to open the floor for clarification questions and answers for about 15 minutes before we embark on a general substantive discussion on each of these sub-items. I now open the floor for your clarification questions, and once again, not on sub-items. So please wait with raising specific issues for discussion on those sub-items until we get to them. I open the floor. Canada, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Co-Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I would like to thank the Secretariat for organizing this meeting and providing all the documents that have been drafted to assist the parties in understanding the topics we'll be covering during the meeting. And I also want to welcome all delegations to Canada. It's always a pleasure to host a meeting of the protocol in Montreal. I do have a few questions which I'll pose in English, so these will be clear for all members of the SAP and the TEEP.
your reports. The quadrennial assessments covered, quite extensively these issues, but it's always useful to have some updated or some additional bits of information that helps us to understand these issues better. We have two questions regarding very short-lived substances and one question regarding the emission factors for feedstock. So with respect to very short-lived substances, we just wanted to maybe have a clear rationale of why the focus is on the 5 in particular that are covered in this report. We noticed in the presentation that these are substances with very high volumes of production. So we wanted to know really if these are maybe the 5 that are most highly produced, the 5 that maybe have the most impact on the ozone layer, because production does not really does not automatically provide us with an indication of the impact of the ozone layer, since in some cases like EDC and CFM, they're produced mostly for feedstock. So I guess we just wanted to know, if by looking at these 5, we're getting really a sufficiently comprehensive picture of the substances that could be of concern to the ozone layer, or possibly if there are others, that we should be aware of, and perhaps could be looked at in the future. Now, with respect to the information provided on alternatives, we noted reference to previous reports from the Solvent Technical Options Committee, some of them dating back to 20 to 25 years, and we heard the information may not have changed that much since then. We're going to address that issue a little bit later in our comments, but we just wanted to know if the TEEP would feel that it would be useful still to have some information, maybe some more recent information from parties that have information, that have adopted alternatives since 2002 to some of these substances. If you feel, no, you have sufficient information, there's no need for parties to provide additional experiences they have, or perhaps that's something that could be of use for a future report or for the quadrennial assessment. That would be interesting to know, because we think there are a number of parties that have adopted measures regarding these substances over the past 20 years, and they may have information on alternatives. Then with respect to feedstock, we noted since 2020 that there's been those new emission factors, revised emission factors. As far as we understand, they apply for the production of feedstock, but they apply for the production of controlled substances generally, irrespective of whether they're used for feedstock or not. I guess I'm talking about particularly the factors that relate to the production, transport, and distribution. Do we assume that these would apply fairly equally to all production, including production of HFCs, which are not used for feedstock? So that's just a clarification or confirmation that we're looking for from the TEEP. So I hope my questions are clear, but if not, I'm happy to rephrase them. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. I will collect a few more questions before giving the floor to TEEP to respond. Kuwait, followed by EU. Kuwait, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and first of all, I would like to thank the government for this meeting here in Montreal, and also I will extend my appreciation for the Secretariat and their team for organizing this meeting and preparing all these documents. I just want to highlight that I appreciate the work and hard work of the SAB and TEEP for giving us the update information about this one. And as you know, I have just two questions, one in relation to the best practice and one in the slide that we are concluding that. I just want to ask a clarification from, say, if the CTC transport-related emission are included. I think that this is a very important issue, that if a country X send their feedstock to another country, how that transportation is being reflected here, because there is some countries are transporting their emissions, or their feedstock, to that one. On the best practice, is the industry rationalization through consolidation of production of substance using controlled substance or feedstock being helpful, or how you look to that element and perspective of this best practice happening in the global now? So I think that's as a general statement, and when we go to subtext, I will go again to ask more deep question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kuwait. Now I would like to give the floor to EU.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. As this is the first time this delegation takes the floor, we'd like to thank the Government of Canada for hosting us so well and providing this wonderful sunshine that we're not enjoying at the moment, unfortunately, but well done. Also, of course, the Ozone Secretariat for organizing this meeting so well, and yes, of course, the TIEP for all the work you have done on this, and it provides a lot of food for thought. And we also have a few questions to start off. On the very short-lived substances, and that also is a bit of a question for the feedstock, it seems that you would be, well, you said that in your presentation also that you're relying on publicly available information and industry experts, so a little bit in the same vein as my Canadian colleague said, so would further information from parties on this help you in this work, in looking into these subjects further? That would be a first general question. A more detailed question is, we read in the report that the solvent use of dichloromethane is going down. Why is this the case? Is that related to available alternatives? On feedstock, in particular, we were interested to read that one-way cylinders is a source of emissions. So we were wondering how common the use of one-way cylinders is in the production of feedstock and the distribution related to it. So that seems to be a very big source of emissions that we'd like to understand how relevant that is in the feedstock production. And then maybe more particularly on the CTC issue, and we read also that going forward there is an issue because of production of, in particular, HFOs as alternatives, that we will be using carbon tetrachloride as a feedstock alternative there, where we don't seem to have much other alternatives. So it will certainly lead to a higher use of CTC and related emissions. So we'd be interested if the TIEP already could give us an idea what they would expect due to the use of HFOs, HCFOs in the future, what that would mean for carbon tetrachloride feedstock production and related emissions, also in terms of the climate, because CTC has a 100-year global warming potential of 1,730, which is of course rather high. So what would that mean for emissions related to HFO productions for the climate effects? Thank you.
Thank you, EU. And now on my list we have United States and Bahrain. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Just to express our appreciation to the SAP and to the TEEP for their always excellent reports that I think are quite informative. We actually had several questions, but they've already been taken up by other members. So I think there's just one item that we wanted to follow up on, and I think this would be a question for the TEEP. But we were particularly interested in how some of the estimates for, I guess the bottom-up estimate, that there have been some changes there, and I think in particular with relation to the emissions factors that are used. I think in the production of CTC for feedstock uses. So maybe it's just a request to the TEEP, if they could go into a little bit more detail on what has changed there. So I think that change, it may originate with some changed guidance in the UNFCCC that relates to emissions from industrial facilities. And so so our understanding is it's a fairly significant increase in the estimated emissions from feedstock facilities, and that's part of what has closed sort of the gap between the bottom-up and the top-down estimates. So maybe it's just a request if the TEEP could go through that in a bit more detail, and then maybe provide any sort of information on how those estimates are applied. So is it just a general estimate of emissions from feedstock production? Is it a different estimate for, CTC as compared to HCFC 22 or different classes of substances? Are the emissions factors different depending on the geographical, the geography of where the plants are located? And/or is there any variation, say, like are there plants that are much tighter and emit less? Are there best practices that can reduce, that the emission factor would be lower for a well-run tight plant? Or is the emission factor just sort of a bulk estimate applied sort of across the board to all plants, irrespective of sort of how they're run and where they're located, that type of thing? So I'll leave it there. Thanks again for the report, very helpful, and appreciate any clarification on that one additional question.
Thank you, United States. I have on my list Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but if you could wait, I would now give the floor to TEEP and the SAP to respond the questions. TEEP, you have the floor.
All right, let me try and start, and I won't listen to myself. I'll try and start, and then I'll defer to my colleagues for adding any other information that I might not cover. Okay, so first we had Canada asking us about the rationale for why we looked at the 5 chlorinated very short-lived substances. As we outlined in the report, it was kind of perhaps twofold reason. One, because of the high volume, and one of those 5 substances also has a very major impact on ozone depletion, well, relatively speaking, out of those very short-lived substances, which is dichloromethane. So which is why the SAP kind of provided us updated information on that, because that's one of their focuses, is the dichloromethane, because out of the very short-lived substances, it's the dichloromethane that perhaps has the highest emissions and impact. So we also chose those 5 chlorinated very short-lived substances because we have information available for those substances. As we said, this information isn't reported anywhere, so we have to get publicly available information or have information available through our industry experts. And because these are very high volume substances, there is publicly available information. For trivial kind of very short-lived substances, we might not be able to find that sort of information. I think that covers off on that. Yes, in terms of whether we can have more help on information, The answer is yes. If parties have information on quantities of very short-lived substances being produced, we would definitely appreciate receiving that and including that in our 2026 assessment report. And information on alternatives. You asked whether there was sufficient information there, and again, you know, we always welcome information from parties so that we can include it in our quadrennial assessments. I think there was a question from Canada about the feedstock emission factors and whether we include, well, I think it was, yes, we include production, transport, distribution, supply chain in our emissions estimates, and we also include, in an additive way, emissions from feedstock use, because that's kind of the next process where you would get emissions. So it's not just the feedstock production, it's the feedstock use as well. And do we include HFCs too in those emission? Oh, that's right. There was that question about, in fact, there are a couple of questions about the emission factors, so maybe I'll take the US one at the same time. You know, there was a question about there are different substances, how do you estimate these things? Of course, all of these substances have different properties, you know, they're used in different ways, there are different facilities across the world, there are HFCs, there are HCFCs, there are, you know, so we're looking at things across the board. What was I going to say? So when we came up with those most likely emission factors, we took into account the range of possibilities, the range of whether it's modern or historic type facilities, and that information about how we went about that is included in the 2022 assessment report and in this report. But we do look at the age of plants, whether they're modern, and it is across the board. So it is an average. For the CTC, for example, if we need to kind of drill into a particular substance and understand emission factors from its use, you know, we might apply a different emission factor because we need to in that circumstance. But when we're trying to provide you with generalised information, we would use the most likely emission factors. In the CTC analysis, we used industry information, published reports to refine those emission factors specifically for CTC, and I hope that makes sense. Do you want to say anything else? All right, so that was emission factors. Kuwait asked about transport related. I think I covered that. Yes, we do include transport emissions in the emission factors. And you also asked about industry rationalisation, which Nick will cover. Nick Campbell, MCTOC member, sorry.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, the Q8 question on rationalisation is an interesting question because what we're actually seeing in the fluorocarbon industry is very much a consolidation of production. And to answer your question, as such, the plants are, or the manufacturing facilities are becoming a lot bigger. And as such, the best practice is being transferred onto these facilities because they are handling considerably larger tonnages of the feedstocks and such like. And clearly, economically, they do not want to lose any of the product that they possibly can, and hence the best practices are transferred onto the larger plants. And we have seen that globally, and in particular in the new facilities, a lot of which are in Article 5 countries. We were asked the question from the EU about one-way cylinders. Well, to my knowledge, I have no knowledge of one-way cylinders being used to transport products for feedstock. If you have any, we're grateful for that information. What you tend to get in feedstock applications is the product is either piped from the manufacturing facility of the feedstock into the facility that it's going to be used as a feedstock for production of another chemical, or it is transferred in large 18, 20-ton tankers, which is why we have included information in the emission factors of the emissions that are likely when you transfer the product into the tankers. The smallest feedstock transfers I have ever seen were in the large 45-gallon drums, but I do not believe that continues anymore because the processes are so big. So if you have information on one-way cylinders being used for feedstock, I'm both concerned and would very much appreciate any information you've got on that. The US asked a question about the guidelines and the change for the fluorinated industry emission factors. What we have done is we have incorporated the guidelines from IPCC for the reporting factors and for the emissions from fluorinated production. And I should say that that was very much influenced by a major report that the USA EPA produced just before the last version of the IPCC guidelines were produced. And in fact, those guidelines for the basic tier of reporting actually were 4% emissions from production, and that's what was incorporated. I should say that was the basic tier of reporting, and of course that did not include if you had incineration or such like on the plants. The basic tier was 4%, but that was incorporated into our thinking. For CTC, there was also some expert information included from some of our experts globally on what they knew the emissions to be they measured or be they calculated from some of the global plants for CTC. Thank you.
I'll just come back because I missed one question from the EU about CTC used as feedstock for HFO's production and what we might expect in terms of trends for HFOs and what that might mean for CTC production. And the short answer is predicting the future volumes of CTC required for HFOs is a very uncertain exercise, and I think I'll just leave it at that. Or Nick might want to say something.
Not on that subject. We do not normally make market predictions because that is not something that TIAB does. I think the only other comment I wanted to make was on the comment on expert information on the VSLS. As you said, we would welcome expert information on the VSLS, but I think we can take it a bit further than that because we have virtually no experts on the uses of VSLS on the MCTOC committee because they are not compounds that have actually been controlled under the Montreal Protocol. So if parties have experts on the uses of the VSLS and the alternatives to the chlorinated VSLS, then we would welcome interaction with those experts because it will help us build our knowledge and provide you with a more thorough assessment in the 2026 assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. On my list, I have Bahrain, Senegal, and India, and with that, I would like to close the list. And now I would like to give the floor to Bahrain.
Shukran.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I would like also to thank MC Talk as well as the Scientific Assessment Panel, the SAP, for the excellent presentations, which included a wealth of information. I would like to add a question with regard to the VSLS, the very short-lived substances. We have heard questions about 5 substances which have been focused upon, and how certain substances have not been reported by certain countries. We know that the report relies on information presented by experts and people in the industry in order to present us with calculations. How can we know the realistic effect of those substances on the ozone layer? We understand from the report, which has been presented by the experts, that the emissions are not limited to those 5 VSLS. So how can we understand the future effect of VSLS? We do not understand yet the effect of substances that are not presently or currently controlled and reported on. So can we have more clarifications on this subject? This is very important to us as parties and countries. Additionally, I would like to talk about feedstock uses. Over the 10 past years, we have seen a 66% increase in the use of feedstock. My question is, do we have a study that predicts further increase in the future, or was there a certain particularity which led to the 66% in the past? So we would need to know if we have predictions for the future. Does the study limit itself to the 10 past years because of particular reasons, especially with regard to the 60% increase? Thank you.
Thank you, Bahrain. Floor to Senegal.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Our delegation wishes to take the floor. This is the first time we are taking the floor. And we wish to take this opportunity to thank Canada for having organized this meeting here in Montreal. And we thank the Secretariat for the excellent organization and all of the facilities that have been kindly granted to us. We have are grateful for the opportunity to participate in today's meeting. We also wish to thank the SAP and the TIEP for their excellent work. And we do have some questions to pose specifically related to other international conventions related to the climate on the CTC feedstock. Our question also has to do with what Bahrain has mentioned about the 5 very short-lived substances, the VSLSs. And specifically, the quantities which are being used, which have continuously risen in recent years. On feedstocks and CTCs, specifically the relationship to the climate, those related to the climate, we wish to have more information, please, specifically on the emissions factors. In the response, and the statement from the United States mention was made of the use of data from industries and certain publications, but we wish to have certainty that the DPCC policy was applied, because the CTCs mean that we have our own research carried out in this regard. And I now turn to the production of PVCs. This is one of the most significant plastic substances used throughout the world. There's a new convention, a new agreement, an international agreement that has been arrived at. This is a legally binding agreement on plastics for the future. And so I wish to refer to the link, the coordination between this increase in plastics. And I wish to take this opportunity to highlight the synergy between the other international conventions, the climate conventions, and the future plastics agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Senegal. India, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Good morning, everybody. As this delegation is taking the floor for the first time, we would like to thank the Government of Canada for hosting the meeting, and the Executive Secretary, Ozone Secretariat, and her team for the timely documentation for this meeting. We would like to thank the SAP and the team for the very informative presentations. We would like to have a clarification from the co-chair on whether a detailed clarification on each of the three issues can be sought now, or is there going to be a substantial discussion on each item separately? Thank you, co-chair.
Thank you, India. Yes, as mentioned before, there will be separate sub-items discussed later on after this item. And is that it?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Tip to respond to the questions from Bahrain and Senegal. Thank you. Tip, you have the floor. Okay, Seb, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the esteemed delegate from Bahrain about short-lived substances, very short-lived substances, and what other substances might there be out there that we're not getting information about. I would emphasize that the SAP is reliant on the observational community to supply information about other short-lived chlorinated and brominated gases in the atmosphere and their distribution. And certainly this list here that we're talking about and have been talking about within the assessments focuses on those likely to contribute the most substantial amounts. There may be others that also contribute. If we look at the tables in the appendix, those chemicals likely have even shorter lifetimes and are likely to be even smaller contributors. But we will continue to look and update the scientific information as more becomes available from the observational communities. I would also just reflect on the issue of market predictions and projections. SAP doesn't do that either, but in Chapter 7 of the scientific assessment, there are scenarios that attempt to consider different ranges of future use of things like feedstocks that may be relevant, and their influence on ozone depletion and ozone recovery that may be relevant for parties to consider as they're wondering about future changes in these uses over time and how they could influence both ozone and climate. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, okay, so just following up some of the questions related to whether the trends in feedstock uses, just going back to the issue of, you know, how we can predict the future. As the SAP just indicated, you can do, of course, hypothetical scenarios, but you know, one of the worst things that we could do is make a prediction and then have that not transpire, and this body taking decisions based on, you know, a suggestion from us in 2024 of what might happen in 2030, and that doesn't come to be. So when we say we don't do market trends, you know, we can make some guesses that HFOs will require CTC feedstock for their production, and that might increase, but what the quantity of that might be is hard to predict. Okay. Then there was another question wanting further clarification about the emission factors and our interaction with other treaties. And perhaps I could just clarify, as Nick Campbell elaborated, the emission factors from the IPCC for production emissions don't include incineration, but they are currently at 4%. When the MCTOC looked at that, we wanted to include, have an emission factor that included, you know, the range of industrial operational practices, and that often includes incineration. So our most likely emission factor, taking into account, you know, distribution and losses, the conversion process, and production, comes to 3.6%. So there's not much difference really in those emission factors, but you know, and we also provide a range of emission factors, because what might apply in one country with it might not apply in another. Okay. Did you want to say something about the plastics agreement?
I think just to elaborate slightly further, there is a lot of work being done in the scientific community on measuring emissions, and in particular looking at local emissions from chemical plants. And I know there has been a recent study done in the Netherlands where they are studying the emissions from a HCFC 22 unit that is actually going to be published soon, and that was measuring at the fence the actual emissions that they were getting. So this work will be published, and clearly we will incorporate any of this work in our future reports.
Thank you, TIP and SEP. And with that, I would now like to close the Q&A session. And once again, I would like to thank TIP and TAP for their outstanding work. And you may now go back to your seats. But please be alert in case we need to seek your clarification on any issues. So as mentioned before, we will now deal with the sub-items. And first, we will deal with the agenda item 3A on very short-lived substances. And we all just heard the TIP's presentation on the issue of VSLS, which is reflected in its 2024 progress report. The references are listed on the slide, but you can see on the screen as well. And I would like to open the floor now for a discussion on this sub-item. Delegates, you may wish to make general statements and interventions, and the floor is open. Indira, are you asking for the floor? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Madam Co-Chair, the VSLS are not controlled under the Montreal Protocol and parties are not required to submit data relating to VSLS. While the report states that information has been obtained from experts and publicly available data, we would like to more understanding on the sources of the information presented in the report. Secondly, the MC Talk stated in the report that VSLS are used as feedstocks and some of them also have a considerable emissive solvent use. While the use of chloroform in pharma industry have been mentioned, we would like to have more information on emissive uses of VSLS and if possible in quantities. Thirdly, in table 5.1, the feedstock uses of various VSLS have been mentioned along with production quantities. We would like to understand the impact of each of these substances in quantitative terms on the stratospheric ozone layer. Madam Co-Chair, we also noted that the VSLS have a lifetime shorter than the 6 months. As per our understanding, the important criteria is the steady state ODP of the substances is much more than 6 months, says around 50 to 100 years. Considering this, we need more understanding from the MC Talk on the effects of the VSLS, particularly dichloromethane on the stratospheric ozone layer. As per our understanding, dichloromethane being chemically reactive and having physical solubility, both these factors act on further shorten its lifetime in the lower atmosphere, due to which much less of the already minuscule substance is available for transport into the stratosphere. Once dichloromethane reaches the stratosphere in even a smaller minuscule quantity, it gets attacked by photosynthesis attack of sunlight. Even thereafter, accurate determination of ODP depends on quantifying the amount of chlorine that dichloromethane delivers to the stratosphere. And this poses a difficulty because the transport to the stratosphere may take a year, which is almost double the lifetime of the atmosphere. We would like to have a clarification from the MC Talk on this. While the information on alternatives has been mentioned in section 5.2.3 and table 5.4 of the report, parties would be better informed if detailed mapping of alternatives along with properties against each of the VSLS is done. Additional information on availability, technical feasibility, economic viability, safety and sustainability of such alternatives will also be useful. Lastly, regarding the increase of emissions, it would be desirable if measures to strengthen the existing national systems and processes for minimizing the emissions are stated rather than adding additional elements to the scope of the Montreal Protocol. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. Before giving the floor to TIP, I would now first give the floor to Saudi Arabia, followed by Kenya. Saudi Arabia, you have the floor.
This is the first time that we talk today. I would like to express first our deep thanks to the Government of Canada for the hosting, and I'd like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the wonderful administration of this session. My question has to do with the substances that have very short life cycle in the upper layers of the atmosphere. These substances, as we all know, not all their emissions reach the upper layers of the atmosphere. You have the temperature, humidity, and wind and other influences or other substances that could react with them. So the effect will not be as mentioned in some of the reports. This is why I would like from the experts in the TIP and SAP to reconsider evaluating these substances and their lifespan. What is the mechanism to calculate whether it's 6 months or less? Is it actually 6 months or less? If it's 6 months and there is a mechanism for calculating it, perhaps you would need to also measure other chemicals, whether they are subject to the protocol control or whether they are not subject when we're talking about the 5 nominations. Also, when you look at the report of the TEEP and what we've heard of it and the SAP, they were both built on possibilities, hypothetical possibilities, but not proven scientific facts. So these could increase the credibility of the information and this would help us to reach decisions that would be applied for all countries, and that's in line with Article 7 of the Montreal Protocol, which is a non-compliance. So this is what I would have liked to share, and thank you for your kind attention, and thanks on behalf of the Saudi delegation.
Thank you, Saderbir. I would now like to give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Since this is the first time that this delegation is taking the floor, we wish to thank the Government of Canada for the hospitality. We also wish to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the well organization of this meeting. Madam Co-Chair, we also thank the TIP and SAP for their reports. This delegation has listened carefully to the presentation that has been made and heard that these very short-lived substances are not controlled under the Montreal Protocol, and they are used as feedstocks for production of other chemicals, yet they are not good for health. Hence, some regions have banned, but other regions have not. This delegation would like to request the TIP and SAP whether they may give us some recommendations on the way forward in dealing with these short-lived substances, and whether in the future they should be controlled under the Montreal Protocol. Thank you so much, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, Kenya. With this, first I would like to give the floor to TIP and SAP to respond to India, Saudi Arabia, and Kenya's questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I must admit I was still walking to my chair when so I missed a lot of the questions that came from the delegate from India, whilst I resettled after the question and answer session. But we would be happy to speak with India bilaterally to answer those questions. But I would also note that we have a quadrennial assessment coming up in 2026, and we can take on board those questions in formulating our report. But I would like to hear what those questions were again, because as I said, I missed half of them. And I think that that response perhaps might respond to some of the other questions as well. That in terms from the TEEP perspective, we'd be happy to receive any information from parties on very short-lived substances that they might provide, so that we can incorporate that into the quadrennial assessment. And answer any questions that parties might have in that report.
Thank you, Tip. India, could you repeat the questions once again? Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Actually, we have already emailed. If you want to, then we will again repeat this question.
Email to the Ozone Secretariat, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, could I request the Ozone Secretariat to forward those questions to the TEEP, and then later respond to the India's queries? Thank you. If that is fine with India?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Lesotho, Canada, United States, and Malaysia on my list. First, I would like to give the floor to Lesotho.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Since Lesotho is taking the floor for the first time, let me first of all thank Ozone Secretariat for the excellence organization of the meeting, the government of Canada for the warm welcome. Actually, our point is only on these short-lived substances because as we have seen several documents, including the SAP, they still have the impact to our actual environment. But we think that we need to have more information and see, even if we are saying no strong impact to the ozone layer, but we want to see how far is this impacting us concerning the environment. And maybe as to give us the highlight or the way on how we can in future see on how we can control these substances. Because we believe as we sustain them or as we still use them for the coming future, the impact we might feel as we are going on, or it might also harm the route we are trying to construct using the Montreal Protocol. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Listening to the additional questions that have been raised, it's evident to us that there continues to be a lot of interest and questioning from parties regarding this issue. So, you know, although we had quite a comprehensive question and answer period with the TEEP and the SAP, I think it points to the fact that perhaps it would be useful to have some additional information on this issue earlier than the 2026 quadrennial assessment. And I know we heard the TEEP mention a number of times that, you know, all these issues could be looked at there. However, you know, that assessment, even though it's 2026, it's really, you know, only considered by parties in 2027. So, and we're in 2024, so it's quite some time from now. We note that in scientific literature, there's been increasing information about short-lived substances in various scientific publications. One of them, fairly recent, published last year in Nature by Villamayor et al., is called Very Short-Lived Halogens Amplify Ozone Depletion Trends in the Tropical Lower Stratosphere. And that was published in Nature Climate Change. And in this article, and that kind of reminded us that we forgot to ask a question to the SAP when they were there, but maybe they could take that on, you know, later on. We're trying to reopen the question and answer, but we did have this one question that we forgot to ask. But in this article, the role of very short-lived substances in the long-term tendency of tropical lower stratosphere ozone was revisited using a revised, or what they call a state-of-the-art chemical scheme and emission inventories of halogens, including not just chlorinated substances, but bromine and iodine as well, with a model called the Community Earth System Model. The article notes that the future scenarios considered in the study suggest that by controlling emissions of anthropogenic very short-lived substances, up to 25% of tropical lower stratosphere ozone depletions by the end of the 21st century may be prevented. So we just wanted to first point out this article. We note even that from the article that clearly there's still a very high amount of uncertainty with respect to, you know, definitely linking short-lived substances to depletion of the ozone layer. But still, I think it's an interesting article, and at some point, we would be interested if the SAP could come back to provide us with their opinion of this conclusion in particular. With respect to the work that's been provided by the TEEP and the MC Talk in particular on alternatives to VSLS, we find that that's useful, but we think it would also be useful to have some additional information, perhaps an elaboration of this issue in the 2025 progress report. And we understand that there is a lot of information that was provided in the 1998 and 2002 Solvent Technical Options Committee report, and we looked back to those reports. And I think a lot of the information perhaps could be extracted from there. It's just not clear for us which of those specific applications that are listed in the report apply to the VSLS that we're considering now. And in fact, in that report, the purpose of these reports was to provide alternatives to solvent, in the solvent sector, to CFCs, CTC, and methylchloroform. And when short-lived substances are referred to, they're actually referred to as alternatives to these substances. So the context is a little bit different. And we note that in the TEEP report itself, it suggested that there should be some prudence that's exercised about the out-of-date recommendations, while the report remain a useful source of information on alternatives. So we would be interested maybe in having a little bit more also of conversation with the TEEP to see what could be possible to provide based on the information that's there, how this information could be extracted and structured in a way where parties get more evident information on alternatives. As I mentioned, we think, and based on the response that we heard from the TEEP earlier, we think that there are some parties that may have some information on alternatives that could be useful to provide. We certainly have some information on dichloromethane alternatives in Canada, some research that was done some time ago, but not as old as the 1998 and 2002 reports that perhaps could be useful. So, we could see perhaps an encouragement to parties that have such information to submit that to the TEEP. And just to say that we're not looking at all the VSLS and all the alternatives for all the applications. We think that we could narrow down the request to those VSLS where there are major emissive users and just focus on this. So we're not looking, we noted that there's a very large amount of feedstock use of these substances. We think, the feedstock issue could be addressed separately. Here we're mainly interested in the emissive uses because those are the ones that potentially have an impact on the ozone layer. Or maybe we can set a threshold of emissions beyond which information could be provided because there are many substances that are produced in very small amounts and many substances that don't actually have a lot of emissions because they're mostly used in feedstock. So, for instance, we noticed that from the 5 that were listed, only DCM, TCE, trichloroethylene, and PCE perchloroethylenes have levels of emissive uses above 100,000 tons. So maybe it's sufficient just to focus on these 3, or maybe even just to focus on DCM. I mean, that's something that we could consider in order to make a realistic and manageable request to the TEEP on this issue. One of the things, and this relates to the question we had, we would be interested to know if there are other VSLS that could become of concern or that are currently of concern or that could become a concern in the future because potentially increased productions and emissions, We note, for instance, that there's one CF3I that is being considered as an alternative to Halon 1301 in civil aviation. So even though there may not be significant production and emission now, it would be interesting if we could have at least an identification of what are the other VSLSs that are around. Now, it's true that the annex to the 2022 quadrennial assessment of the SAP lists, potentially hundreds of substances, but it's a very huge annex, and it's not always evident which ones are actually VSLS. This is not something that we think should require a lot of work. Probably the information is there, but just to have maybe a simple listing of what the others are, and maybe some information on where they're used if it's available, but not necessarily looking into providing comprehensive information on alternatives or anything to that level. Finally, with respect to the information in the report that's related to the ozone depleting potential and the impact of the ozone layer, we don't feel it's absolutely necessary that additional information be provided about that, but we heard from some delegations that they would welcome such information. We have to acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty about the impact of these substances on the ozone layer. I think the SAP quadrennial assessment report was clear that there's an estimate that they contribute about 4% of tropospheric ozone or of effective equivalent stratospheric chlorine. So that gives an idea. But when the SAP provides information on this impact, it's often provided as the total impact of chlorinated VSLS, and it notes that dichloromethane is the largest contributor of chlorine from those substances. But it's not clear what the relative contributions of these substances are. So we're wondering if some of that information could be disaggregated a little bit, and if in a future report, whether quadrennial assessment or perhaps the next progress report, there could be a table that lists all the VSLS of potential concern to the ozone layer. And again, perhaps here we could agree on a certain thresholds of emissions, indicating for each substance their recent production and consumption levels, their emissions, their ozone depleting potential, if available. Now, we note that many of them don't have OEDPs in the SAP report, but there have been various peer-reviewed articles that have tried to arrive at some ranges of OEDPs for these substances. So it would be good to maybe to have a table that at least provides this information, noting that perhaps they have not been actually endorsed by the SAP, may still be useful information for us to have. And the relative contribution to ozone depletion, the metric for that could be contribution to equivalent effective stratospheric chlorine, or perhaps another metric. That's something that we would be interested also to have a discussion with other parties and the SAP with respect to what would be, the most appropriate and possible metric that could be used with respect to measuring the impact on the ozone layer, particularly when there's no OEDP that's been agreed for a particular substance. So all in all, we're thinking about a new decision that would have those 3 or 4 elements. We're interested in having some discussions at the margins today and tomorrow before actually introducing this decision in plenary. So if there are delegates that are interested in talking to us about it, then please reach out to us. And likewise, we'll reach out to the TEEP and the SAP with respect to what we have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. First, I would like to now give the floor to TEEP to respond to these queries, but please also respond to the question from the first set of questions that came also from Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I guess I'm a little confused. I heard many comments, but not necessarily questions. And in terms of, I think Kenya asked about, well, anyway, look, I'm just a little bit confused about how I should respond here, sorry.
The question from Kenya was recommendations to deal with under MP. So if you could, yes, Tip, you have the floor. I would now like to give the floor to United States.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Perhaps that'll give us a moment to sort through. So just procedurally, I think the confusion stems from the way we organize our discussion is we just had sort of the question and answer session for the TEEP and the SAP, and so we ran through those points. And I think the comment made by Kenya isn't really a question for the TEEP. It's a policy question of whether we as the parties should be taking some type of action to deal with the issues that are raised in their report. And so to us, listen, maybe just zooming out a little bit, I think the information that we've received from the SAP and the TEEP here is quite helpful. I think similar to what other delegations have, listen, we have a lot of commonality with prior interventions. I think what we have the SAP and the TEEP doing is continuing to inform parties of issues that are relevant to protection of the ozone layer and the climate system. India's quite right. These VSLS substances, they're not controlled substances, but that doesn't mean we're not going to pay any attention to them. It just means we as parties have not agreed to take on control obligations that relate to them. But it's actually quite important that the SAP in particular continues their efforts of global monitoring to keep an eye on these substances so that we have some sense of whether there's significant changes that may have impacts on the stratospheric ozone layer. So maybe just to pick up on a couple specific points that were raised, because I think Canada suggested that they have some interest in putting forward a draft decision. Just first to say we would be quite interested to know more about that and to engage on that. I think the key thing for us to do, and I think Canada said this, listen, there's a lot to the VSLS issue. I think we really need to figure out what it is, if we want more information, that we want to focus on. I would say amongst the VSLS, listen, if you look at the last quadrennial assessment report, if you look, for example, at figure ES8, which looks at changes in radiative forcing in alternative scenarios, changes in ozone in alternative scenarios, you know, the alternative scenario that relates to DCM, it's one of the more prominent scenarios that's on the list in terms of potential impacts to the ozone layer. So to us, DCM in particular is of some interest because I think, yeah, there's a lot of VSLS out there. It's not clear that a lot of them are being used in large volumes, or at least in emissive uses are being used in large volume. So I think to us, we'd be willing to work, you know, in the context, I think, of what Canada proposed, to think, listen, we need to come up with something that, so the SAP and the TEEP already look at this. Every 4 years they report to us. So I think it's the focus on what specifically we want from them that we think is policy relevant to our efforts here, right? And then they inform us. So to India's point, the TEEP and the SAP informing us is just that. We're better informed. Policy measures are only undertaken through proposals by the parties. And just to Kenya's point, that's why we can't ask TEEP to recommend to us what to do. They inform us, and then we as parties, I think, need to figure out what specifically to do. So to us, maybe, I don't know how you want to move forward, co-chair, perhaps getting together in some type of group to talk about some of Canada's proposals. We had some similar ideas. I think their comment on disaggregating, some of the information on VSLSs might be useful. Maybe getting some additional information on regulatory actions or other actions that have already been taken by parties with respect to particular VSLS. So listen, there may be some additional information here that would be useful for us to get. But I would just come back to what I emphasized before. I think we really needs to be focused, narrow, specific to the types of information that we think is most important to get immediately. Because frankly, it's going to be a few years from now, but we will get another general report back in the 2026 quadrennial report. So I think it's a question of really focusing in on what it is that we think in a report perhaps next year the parties would find particularly informative and relevant to our policy discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, United States. On my list, I have Malaysia, Vanuatu, Russian Federation, EU, and Australia. And with that, I would like to close the list, and then would like to give the floor to Malaysia first. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Since this is the first time I'm taking the floor, on behalf of the Malaysian delegation, I would like to express our gratitude to the government and the people of Canada for their warm welcome. Additionally, congratulations to both co-chairs and our great appreciation to the Ozone Secretariat for their excellent arrangements for the 46 open-ended working group meetings in Montreal, Canada. Co-chair, Malaysia thanks the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel and the Scientific Assessment Panel for their excellent work in preparing and updating the decisions related to the very short-lived substances, feedstock uses of both controlled substances and emissions of carbon tetrachloride. Regarding very short-lived substances, which are not controlled substances under the Montreal Protocol, according to the TEEP report, these chemicals are used primarily as solvents and feedstocks. More than 90% are used as feedstocks, particularly the ethylene dichloride, which is used almost exclusively as a feedstock in the production of vinyl chloride monomer. The production and consumption of VCM are tied to the demand for PVC, a substantial product used in our daily lives. If these chemicals are further controlled under the protocol, it may result in significant impacts on the industry and economy. Therefore, we expect that the TEEP will obtain more information on the feasibility and the viability of alternatives for feedstock production, as well as the potential impacts on both the environment and economy. Malaysia delegation would also like to support the concern made by India. Malaysia has taken note of the presentation and looks forward to participating in any further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Malaysia. Now I would like to give the floor to Russia Federation. And I was just closing the list. China has also requested for the floor, so we'll be including China, and then with that we will close the list as well. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. First and foremost, we wish to thank these TEEP TEAP for the very good, concise, and comprehensive at the same time report. The Russian delegation has received all responses in this report to the questions which we had. In our view, the initiative to regulate very short-lived substances does not have any prospects. It does not make sense, and we will try at this point to explain why this does not make sense. The report stated that largely 90 to 100% of these substances are being used as feedstock. What does this mean? This means that at the same factory where they were manufactured, they are used to manufacture other substances, which are then used as a waste. And when it comes to emissions in the atmosphere, there are no such emissions here. So what is our purpose? Our purpose is to control those substances which have an impact on ozone depletion, as well as potent emissions in line with the Kigali Amendment. And these are very short-lived substances do not do one or the other, do not have an impact in either of those areas. And the founding fathers of the Montreal Protocol, I wish to recall, it was not without reason that they did not include in a list of controlled substances very short-lived substances. The very name, very short-lived substances, speaks to the fact that they live for a very short period of time in the atmosphere. They simply cannot have an impact on the ozone layer. They do not rise to the level of the stratosphere, and they do not enter into those reactions. And some here refer to the existing articles which allegedly have some where these substances do have an impact. We very cautiously, we would recommend a very cautious approach to these articles. There are very different articles that exist, and some are unfortunately made to order. There is a need for completely clear scientific basis as well as a practical basis for a whole group of substances to be brought under the Montreal Protocol. This is a very difficult task to achieve because the substances, as was mentioned, there are many of these substances. There are a great number of these substances, and it will be very difficult to control them, even if we are to imagine that a decision is to be taken that there is a need for this and that there's a need to control these substances. It will be very difficult to achieve from the practical standpoint for a party or a state, and for this reason we believe that further consideration of this matter is something for which is futile. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Russian Federation. Now I would like to give the floor to EU.
Okay, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. And thanks again for the work done by the TEEP, and this time around I will also not forget the SAP. They also contributed to this report, so thanks for that very much. So this is an important topic, and despite the fact that these are short-lived substances, as some have pointed out, we read in the reports that this is becoming an important source of chlorine in the stratosphere, as other substances are reducing, and these substances are still contributing with their emissions. So they do get up to the stratosphere, apparently through circulations, depending also where they're emitted, and they're increasingly, as we read in the quadrennial report, adding to the source of chlorine, which is of course related to the ozone depletion. The dichloromethane appears to be the most relevant substance here, but it's not the only one, so we're interested also to look beyond just dichloromethane. And it was interesting, though, to see, and thanks to the SAP again in the presentation this morning, that this upward trend on the dichloromethane seems to be confirmed by the latest 2 data points that they added to this. So that is interesting to have on our radar.
We share the concern of some of these short-lived substances, and we are in our domestic regulation observing or monitoring them. So there is obligatory reporting. We added dichloromethane and perchloroethylene recently to this monitoring. And just to respond to also what has been mentioned, not all of these substances are used entirely as feedstocks. Some of them are used in emissive uses, in particular solvent use, dichloromethane for instance, and that is a large source of emissions, which then reach up in the atmosphere as the scientists are telling us. So also we'd like to remind parties about the Vienna Convention Article 2.1, where parties are obliged to adopt appropriate legislative or administrative measures to control, limit, reduce, or prevent human activities should it be found that these activities have or are likely to have adverse effects resulting from modification or likely modification of the ozone layer. That's quoting the article, and that clearly would be applicable in this case where the source of chlorine in the stratosphere would have an effect on the ozone layer. So this is certainly something we should be concerning ourselves with. It is interesting to read in the report by the TIAP that there are alternatives that are being used in some sectors, and that even that report is 20 years old. This morning the TIAP said in their feedback to us that some of these alternatives, that information has not changed and they remain relevant and can be used. So there is a way of avoiding some of these emissions. So in addition to alternatives, in the report we also read there is a safe use of solvents preventing emissions. There is what is called a preferential use cascade for solvents, where the chlorinated substances are rather at the end, so there are other alternatives that can be used before we need to resort to the use of some of those VSLS. So that is a way of preventing emissions. There are alternatives in paint stripping, there are alternatives in foam blowing, there are alternatives in pharmaceuticals and chromatography. So there is some relevant data on where we can avoid, and it might be good to remind ourselves on these ways of avoiding emissions. It's for us very important, therefore, to keep working on this issue. There's certainly, as others have said before, a need for further information, to collect more information, but we also think it would be important that we already try to avoid the use of VSLS where this is not warranted, where we have good alternatives. So we are very happy to engage with Canada on their prospective CRP. We may have some ideas of our own to contribute to this. And also on the issue of the number of parties having questions to the TIAP that may not have been able to address here, maybe this is one way of having a group, preferably a contact group, where the TIAP is invited to answer to these questions in more detail than we can do here in the plenary. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, EU. Now I would like to give the floor to Australia.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. Firstly, we would like to thank the Secretariat for the preparations for this meeting, and indeed also to Meg for her very kind words about our dear colleague Patrick, who we miss in our delegation, but indeed I think all parties will miss his good counsel and guidance. We would like to also note how happy we are to be back in Canada again for our second meeting this year, and we'll be back here again for our third meeting in December. We appreciate the co-chairs taking on this leadership role, and we are in good hands this year. And finally, we'd like to thank the TEEP, particularly the MACTOC and the SAP for their work on addressing the three decisions, and particularly the one on very short-lived substances, which is the agenda item we are talking about today. So we only have, actually, I think our actual intervention will be shorter than my introductory thank yous. Just a couple of brief comments to say that while indeed some of the very short-lived substances are used as feedstock, I think the TEEP was very clear that DCM, TCE and PCE are predominantly emissive uses, and that it is definitely important for the parties to keep any issues or any chemicals that may affect the recovery of the ozone layer under review. And I think that the information we have from the SAP is that these emissions of very short-lived substances do affect the ozone layer, and therefore it is incumbent upon parties to make sure that they are under review on a regular basis, even though those particular substances are not controlled under the Montreal Protocol. I think our understanding of the many questions posed by India was that they were broader questions, perhaps not specifically for answer here in this session, but perhaps questions that they would like to see answered in the longer term. And I think perhaps the 2026 assessment report is a good place for those questions to be answered or to be updated. I certainly think that some of the information that the distinguished delegate from India asked were questions that had been addressed in previous assessment reports, but there is always the opportunity to update information. And I certainly did hear from the MACTOC the willingness and interest to provide more information as much as they can in the next assessment report that they are preparing. We did hear with interest the specific questions from Canada that they would like perhaps to see some more information on. And then I think the question for us as parties is which of those questions can be answered in the assessment report, which I understand actually the TEEP will be working on next year, and which questions we actually want answers on a little bit more quickly than that. So I think that's something that we should probably, as parties, try and sort through to make sure that we are getting the information that we need, but not putting an undue burden on the TEEP, especially if they are working on their assessment report next year. So happy to engage and to work with Canada and others on a draft CRP. Thank you.
Thank you, Australia. Now I would like to give the floor to China.
Thank you, Chair. First, on behalf of the delegation, I would like to thank Ozone Secretariat for the arrangement. We also like to thank the Government of Canada for the hospitality. First, we would like to thank TEEP and SAP for the work done on VSLS, which provide important information to parties continuously. We note that in the progress report, the only ODP value is less than 0.04. So the others are unknown. We'd like to reiterate that the VSLS is not controlled by protocol. According to the current assessment, the impact on the stratosphere and ozone layer is small. We know there are in some countries are regulated by policies due to environmental and health controls. We are for the study on these substances, but there need to be processes, and there cannot be progress made on each year. But we need to focus on our work. Our work is on the impact on the ozone layer. Therefore, since VSLS is already in the report on the 2026 assessment report. So we need to wait for more information to be provided so that we can have a better understanding and more effective work. We'll keep monitoring the information provided in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, China. And let me consult with my co-chair on the way forward. Just give us a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you, delegates. After consulting with my co-chair, we propose to have an informal group to be coordinated by Canada, interested parties, to discuss ideas that have been raised by delegates, including further work for the panel, and to develop a concrete proposal. And we would also like to request TEEP to join the discussion. And if this is an acceptable way forward, we would like to request the OZO Secretariat to inform us a time and room for the discussion. Yes, thank you. With that, I would now like to hand over to my co-chair to continue with the other agenda items. Thank you.
That easy. Mike? Yes. Okay. That's, yeah, but this is not, yeah, maybe. It's strange. Okay. I swapped the mic. It's not working. Now we're going to agenda item 3B on feedstock use and controlled substances. So there's now the time to, after we heard the presentation of TEEP, to hear the general statement and interventions from the floor. So please, who would be the first one to give an intervention on, let's say, the item of feedstock use of controlled substances? I see India on my list. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Co-Chair, the MC talk has given the recent and historical trends in the production and use of ODSs as feedstocks. Further, table 5.8 presents details of feedstock application of various controlled substances. It has been stated by the TEEP that some feedstocks and byproducts have non-feedstock uses. Can have more details on such uses? We would also like to understand from the MC talk regarding the fugitive leakage or losses of the ODSs used as feedstocks, if any, considering the national processes frameworks in place. Secondly, we would like to have more understanding from the MC talk on the impact of the emissions in terms of percentage with respect to total production of controlled substances for feedstock uses. We would further like to understand from the MC talk additional information other than covered in the previous TEEP reports on feasible and viable alternatives that can be used to reduce the feedstock production of controlled substances. Thirdly, we would like to understand more regarding the methodology of the estimates of annual global emissions of controlled substance, particularly where noticeable differences have been observed on global scale, as well as emission factors considered for production, distribution, and use of feedstocks. In table 5.20, detailed analysis has been presented on various products using controlled substances as feedstocks. We would like to understand the methodology adopted for the analysis and the data sources. Lastly, we would like to understand from the MC talk on strengthening the existing processes and mechanism in place for management of feedstock uses for controlled substances. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. And well, some questions also to MC talk, so maybe they can react later on, or TEEP can react later on. I don't have any other participant now on my list. Yes, I have Australia.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good afternoon again. Australia thanks the MC talk for its updated information on feedstock uses of controlled substances in response to decision 35.8. We note that feedstock uses of controlled substances continues to increase year on year, and that not only did feedstock uses of controlled substances increase by 66% in the last 10 years, but it actually increased by 41% over the last 5 years. We also note that the use of HCFC 22 as a feedstock continues to increase and now comprises 50% of all feedstock uses. We saw from the MACTOC report that the average emission factor suggested of around 3.6% for feedstocks is sort of the generally acceptable, is what they have provided to us as an average. Most of this percentage emission actually relates to the production of feedstock chemicals. If we were to take the tonnage of controlled substances used as feedstocks in 2022 of nearly 2 million metric tonnes and apply this emission factor, the amount of controlled substances emitted in 2022 would be around 70,000 metric tonnes. But of course, in CO2e tonnes, that number would be considerably higher and much more problematic. We think that this challenges the long-held assumption made by parties that feedstock uses of ODS should be exempted from consumption accounting because emissions from these uses are negligible. They are clearly not negligible. We consider that we have actually been provided quite sufficient information by the MACTOC for parties to actually consider this issue from a policy perspective. We note the many questions that have been posed to the TEEP from India, and we think that actually many of those again can be addressed in their 2026 assessment report. As we indicated last year, we remain concerned about the large emissions estimated to be coming from feedstock uses of controlled substances, and we do take very seriously the advice from the SAP provided last year, which indicated they considered emissions from feedstock uses to be one of the top 3 threats to the recovery of the ozone layer. With that in mind, and with the updated information provided by the MACTOC this year, we are considering development of a CRP on this issue, and we hope to present it to parties for consideration later this week, and we'd be very happy to work with others on the development of that CRP and to consult with others, obviously, if and when we can get that presented. Thank you.
Thank you, and good to hear that you are thinking of presenting a CRP later this week. The next one on my list is EU, and then I have Micronesia. So if others would like to be on the list, please indicate that. But first, EU.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And we'd like to thank the MC-TOC for the work done. Lots of my speaking points are similar to previous speaker, that we see with a concern the emissions, and first of all the production of feedstocks rising every year, 6 to 7% every year for the last 10 years, and concomitantly that the emissions are also rising. Also, as we've, in the Q&A section, we had a question on HFO production. So the fact that some of these feedstocks are linked to some other substances that we're producing more and more just indicates to us that in the future there will be more of them, even though the TIEB wasn't able at this moment to give us an estimate of how much that might be. But there seems to be certainly something to have on our radar screen that these amounts will increase. Also, we would certainly see that the notion that emissions from feedstocks are insignificant does not seem to hold when we look at the figures that we read in the report. We are provided with low, medium, and high scenarios. Even if we take the low ones, it's in the percentages range, so it's not insignificant. If we take the high estimates, we come to over 15% of losses, which is dramatic. So certainly this is an issue. Just to point again to the Vienna Convention that we need to take action if there is an adverse effect on the ozone layer, and this seems to be the case here. There are some quick wins, it seems. The TIAB has informed us about some measures that could be taken, and just to mention a couple, there is, of course, best practices on monitoring and reporting, the training of personnel. There is the possibility of using best practicing during distribution, storage, transport, handling, and repackaging. And in this case, it was a bit surprising to us, the answer from the TIAB that the non-refillable cylinders are not used. Well, in their report, it is one of the issues that is mentioned here. So maybe we can also have some clarifications on that at some point. Further, there could be abatement technologies used in new plants. There is regulatory incentives to avoid emissions, and of course in the end there's also possibilities of using alternatives. And maybe that's the last point, is something where we could, looking forward, have more information on those promising pathways where there are alternatives that could be used. That might be one way of focusing also our work going forward with the TEEP. So just in light of these findings of the existing emissions and the growing importance looking forward, we think this needs to be discussed. We're very happy to hear that Australia is already having some ideas, so we'll be happy to engage there. And we'd like to discuss in a group, preferably a contact group, also on these matters. And probably have the TIAB again in the group for further clarifications. Thank you.
Next speaker on my list is Micronesia, and I have then Switzerland, Norway, China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Republic of Tanzania, and then Canada. So if there's others who would like to speak, please indicate that. So, but first, Micronesia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We are pleased to have you both leading our work this week. It is especially nice to have a touch of island charm on the dais. We are grateful for your guidance and support. Good morning, colleagues. The delegation of the Federated States of Micronesia wishes to begin by extending our heartfelt thanks to the Government of Canada for hosting this meeting and ensuring beautiful weather for the week. We also wish to thank the Secretariat for their excellent work in preparing this meeting. Our delegation would like to thank the TIAB for its informative report on feedstock uses. The report sheds light on the alarming and significant increase in emissions of controlled substances. It is equally alarming that this increase is driven by feedstocks that are ingredients to create plastics. It is timely to draw attention to the connection between the use of ODSs and HFCs as feedstocks and plastic production. We would welcome further information in this regard in future reports. When ODSs, HFCs, and associated feedstocks are turned into plastics, they end up polluting land, fresh water, and our delicate marine environments. Like so many environmental crises, the impact of these pollutants are felt significantly by countries and communities that are not responsible for producing, exporting, or significantly utilizing them. Countries like our own are often burdened with the health, environmental, and economic impacts. Taking steps to consider ways to minimize feedstock emissions could have multiple environmental benefits, including providing additional protection of the ozone layer and the climate system, and reducing plastic pollution. This work could complement the important work underway to adopt a global treaty to address plastic pollution this year, in which all parties here are also involved. We support the statements made by the distinguished delegate from Australia that there is that there is sufficient information available at this time to move to policy considerations. We look forward to discussing this issue further at this meeting with other interested parties, whether in the context of a contact group or otherwise. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Next speaker on my list is Switzerland.
Morning, colleagues, and since this is the first time this delegation takes the floor, we would like to thank the Secretariat for their very diligent preparation of this meeting, the assessment panels for their excellent work, and the government and the people of Canada for welcoming us in their country and in the city of Montreal, which reminds us of the long history and the importance of this protocol, the importance it has for humankind, its past achievements, as well as of the relevance for the future that our work today and in this upcoming week will have. We share the concerns expressed by the delegation from Australia, and we thank them for bringing this forward and bringing this to attention for all of us. The TEEP report showed once more the relevance of emissions from feedstock, which have been increasing over the last years and which we now can expect that this trend might continue further in the future with an increasing global demand for alternatives to controlled substances. We recognize that our assumptions on the emissions from feedstock being insignificant is outdated. We heard a number around 4% today, and as parties of the Montreal Protocol, we have the responsibility to consider necessary actions. So we would be very much interested to participate in the discussion and would welcome a contact group on this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Switzerland. It's good to know what your idea forward is. I have here on my list, and I mention all the delegations, Norway, China, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Canada, and Brazil. If others would like to speak, please indicate it now, because then I would like to close the list. United States. Yeah, so then it's Norway, China, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Brazil, United States, and then I close the list, and then I give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and good morning, everyone. We would like to thank the Secretariat for their hard work in the preparation of this meeting, and also to thank the people of Canada for their warm hospitality. We thank also the assessment panels for compiling all this useful information, also considering the breadth of information that they already provided us in many previous reports. We would like to add our voice to the previous statements and express our concerns regarding the growing emissions related to feedstock uses of controlled substances. For us, it is timely that we collectively address this issue in this body, and we would like to thank the Government of Australia for taking the initiative of working on the CRP, and we are interested in discussing further which kind of action we could be taken for addressing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you also for being brief and concise. And then the next one on my list is China.
谢谢主席. Thank you, Co-Chair. First of all, we would like to thank TEEP and SEP for conducting the study and analysis on the feedstock uses of controlled substances at the request of COP. And from the report, the uses, the feedstock uses involves a lot of a big range, and it's very complicated. We see the high increase of feedstock uses, but we should also look at its necessity. We believe that emission from feedstock uses indeed has an influence on the ozone layer, but we have to emphasize that feedstock uses are not controlled by the protocol. We hope that TEEP, in terms of technology, could give more reference. For example, the technology for reducing leak and the alternatives. But at the same time, we have to look at the feasibility, viability, safety, and sustainability. We'll continue to keep an eye on the production, use, and emission of controlled substances for feedstock uses, and we'll stay engaged in the relevant discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, China, and also by being brief and concise. Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Co-Chair, for giving me the opportunity to speak a second time. The question is the following. Are we concerned about feedstock uses or about their emissions? We know that these feedstock uses are important, and we know that they have a certain effect on the ozone layer. We hope that the TEEP will focus on the final products and not only on feedstock uses. The feedstock could lead to leakages during transportation and other processes. Therefore, it is very important to focus on the life cycle of those substances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are already almost at 1 o'clock, and we have to stop at 1. My proposal is to come back after lunch, and then Canada, Brazil, and the United States can make their statements, and then we finalize this agenda item. And the Secretariat has an announcement to make.
Thank you, co-chairs. Good afternoon, delegates. The Secretariat would like to make the following announcements. The daily subsistence allowance for funded delegates will be issued from counters 6 and 7 at the Registration Center, Lower Atrium, from 1 to 3 p.m. Please bring your passports and boarding pass. The bistro on level 1 will be open from 11 to 3 p.m. today and tomorrow for food and beverages. You're all invited to the reception tomorrow, which will be held at the 4th floor foyer, which is outside the plenary hall from 6 to 8 p.m. The Secretariat adopted its environmental management system in 2022, which commits the Secretariat to upholding and improving the sustainability of its meetings. Participants can support this initiative by bringing your own water bottles and lineages from previous meetings. More information on greening our meetings and travel can be found on our meeting portal. The Code of Conduct at UN meetings is applicable to all participants at this meeting, and more on this can be found from our meeting portal. Thank you.
So see you all after lunch. Have a good lunch and also good side events.